There were better places to be in Europe in the 1840s than the taverns on the waterfront of Hamburg. In the shabby bars, filled with sailors, outcasts, and the derelicts of Hamburg's slums, there was a boy who played piano. Usually his dance music, although expertly played, could barely be heard above the noise of the boisterous clientele. The boy kept a book propped up on the piano so he could read while he played, and when he got sleepy, the bartenders gave him a drink to keep him awake. At the end of the night, he took his earnings home to his family, sometimes walking back with his father, who was a bass player in the bars. Back in the tavern, no one suspected that this young pianist would become a world-famous composer someday, and the last in a trio of musical masters reverently nicknamed the Three Great Bs: Bach, Beethoven, and Brahms. Johannes Brahms was born in Hamburg, May 7, 1833. He lived during an age when music was making a transition from the classical tradition of composers like Beethoven and Haydn to the new dramatic romantic style of composers like Franz Liszt and Richard Wagner. His work blended both. Brahms' mother, who was 17 years older than his father, was an affectionate woman with big blue eyes and one leg shorter than the other. She was a former servant girl and seamstress, who everyone thought made an odd match for Brahms' father. At the time of their marriage, he was a handsome, healthy young man in uniform with artistic talents. She was 41, he was 24. Brahms' father, also named Johannes, was a skilled orchestra musician whose specialty was the double bass, the largest and deepest toned of all the bow instruments. He started teaching his son the basics of music when he was only 6, with the plan of training him to be an orchestra musician like himself. But when Johannes began taking piano lessons from a special tutor, it became clear to everyone that his special talents were as a pianist. He made such rapid progress that he soon outgrew his teacher and had to find a more advanced one, named Eduard Markson, who took him under his personal direction when he was 10 years old. By the time he was 11, Brahms was giving small private concerts to earn funds to continue his studies. It was then that an offer came that might have sent him in a different direction and deprived the world of one of its greatest composers. The offer was for a concert tour of America, a tour that would have no doubt established him as a child prodigy. But his teacher, sensing that Brahms had exceptional talent and shouldn't be commercially exploited, convinced his father to keep Brahms at home, pursuing his lessons. It was the very next year that Brahms began his first compositions. The Brahms family was poor, terribly poor, and it soon became necessary for Brahms to make his own living. So when he was 13, he began playing piano at the taverns on the waterfront, at restaurants, and dance halls. He studied all day and entertained into the early hours of the morning, thus coming close to a physical collapse. Just in time, a music lover offered to take him into the country for a vacation, where he rested, wrote vocal music, and played piano for his own pleasure. When he returned to Hamburg, Brahms began playing to support himself again, this time concentrating on dances. He also gave music lessons and regular concerts, but none of them brought him any recognition. By now he was an expert musician, but he played the piano with a subtle, sensitive touch, and not the dramatic flair that attracted the attention of the public. His number of compositions was growing, however, and so were his contacts. When he was 17, he met the famous gypsy violinist Edward Remenyi, who introduced him to the Hungarian folk songs that later influenced his own music. Soon after, he met another renowned violinist named Joseph Joachim, who became one of his closest friends. At the age of 20, Brahms went on a concert tour with Remenyi to the city of Göttingen, where he had his first opportunity to show his real talents. The two were about to play one of Beethoven's sonatas when they discovered at the last minute that the piano was tuned a half-tone too low. Brahms simply sat down and transposed the entire sonata from A to B flat without making a single mistake. His friend Joachim was so astounded by this that he gave Brahms letters of introduction to several eminent people in the field of music, including the composer Robert Schumann, who was then in the city of Dusseldorf. On this first tour, Brahms also met Franz Liszt, who praised his piano sonatas. The two never became friends, however, and 7 years later Brahms signed a manifesto which attacked the new music which Liszt championed. As soon as he was free of his tour, Brahms hastened to Dusseldorf and introduced himself to Robert Schumann and his extraordinary wife, Clara. It turned out to be the most important meeting of his career. Clara Schumann was a woman who devoted her whole life to music and musicians, and who makes a fascinating biography in her own right. She was the daughter of a piano teacher, a piano virtuoso and composer herself, the wife of composer Robert Schumann, and later the lifelong friend and support of Johannes Brahms. Schumann's life was short and tragic. He started out as a promising young pianist, but an injury to his right hand ended his career and directed him instead towards composing. Clara played his compositions for him and helped him organize his many projects as a composer, music critic, and founder of a musical journal. But overwork, lack of success, and emotional instability led Schumann to suffer a nervous breakdown. One day, after suffering hallucinations, he threw himself into the Rhine River. Although he was rescued, he was committed to an asylum and died there 2 years later in 1865. After his death, Clara Schumann and Johannes Brahms continued a long and affectionate relationship that's one of the most famous in the history of the arts. At their first meeting back in 1853, the Schumanns and Brahms hit it off immediately, and Brahms became a regular guest at their house. They sang together, played duets, laughed a lot, and had long discussions about music. They even wrote a sonata together and were delighted when the violinist Joachim guessed exactly which sections had been written by whom. At this time, Brahms was in his early 20s. He had long, straight, straw-colored hair combed back from his forehead, high cheekbones, fair skin, and a sensuous mouth. He looked something like one of the romantic poets of Lord Byron's time. He had a high voice that didn't change until he was 24 years old. Through the Schumanns, Brahms met many of the leading musicians and composers of his time. More importantly, Schumann wrote a glowing review of Brahms' own work in his magazine, The New Music Journal, in which he hailed him as the coming genius of German music. The article created a sensation, and from that moment on, Brahms was a force to be reckoned with. From that moment on, he was also smack in the middle of the musical controversy of his time. Schumann was in the traditional conservative camp, and so his sponsorship of Brahms alienated Brahms from the new romantics like Liszt and Wagner. It didn't help that Brahms had once fallen asleep when Liszt was playing the piano for him. Nevertheless, the article by Schumann was a turning point for Brahms. It led to opportunities to publish his compositions for the first time. That, in turn, inspired him to compose even more. The only thing that interrupted his happiness was the beginning of Schumann's illness and breakdown. As his friend steadily deteriorated, Brahms made many trips to Dusseldorf to be near him. On one of these visits, he wrote Variations on a Theme of Schumann, and began a symphony which he later changed into sonatas for 2 pianos. The following year, Schumann was placed in a hospital in Bonn, and Brahms traveled there also to continue to support his friend. All through Schumann's illness and eventual death, Brahms was close by, helping in any way he could. For a period of 2 years, he helped Clara manage her house, take care of her children, and organize her library of books and music. Besides caring for Clara, Brahms always worried about the financial welfare of his parents. As he made his way in the world and his income increased a little, he was always careful to send part of it home to his family. He also advised his father before he left, "If things go badly with you, the best consolation is always in music. Read carefully in my old Saul, and you'll find what you need." His father found this advice rather puzzling until one day, out of curiosity, he took down the score of Saul and opened it. There, between the pages, was a supply of cash. After Schumann's illness, Brahms devoted himself to conducting and teaching in his native city of Hamburg, and at the court of a prince named Lippe Detmold. He continued composing, this time trying his hand at folk songs, and he founded a woman's chorus, for which he especially composed a number of songs. Schumann died in 1856, when Brahms was 23 years old, and Brahms continued his devoted friendship with Clara. He seems to have fallen in love with her eventually, but the relationship always remained one of simply deep friendship. The closest Brahms ever came to marriage appears to be an affair he had in 1858, when he was 25 years old, but that too led nowhere. Perhaps Brahms could express his deepest emotions only through his music. Or perhaps he was aware of his own grumpiness and how difficult it would be to live with him. He once wrote, "I couldn't bear to have in the house a woman who has the right to be kind to me and to comfort me when things go wrong." Brahms was known for his sarcasm and rudeness, almost as much as he was known for his humor and geniality. He could go either way, depending on his mood. One of his most famous quotes was the one he made upon leaving a group of friends after a gathering at which he'd managed to offend almost everyone. Pausing at the door as he exited, he said, "If there is anyone here whom I have not insulted, I beg his pardon." In spite of his irascibility, Brahms always had a large circle of friends and patrons, and he had an intense love of children and animals. He always kept his pockets full of candy and little pictures which he handed to neighborhood children as he took his daily walks. By the time he was in his 30s, Brahms had made a name for himself in the musical world, and like most great artists, the controversy increased with the fame. Because he used traditional musical forms, even though he used them in innovative ways, he was accused by some of being an academic who was tied to the past. There's no doubt Brahms had a deep respect for the past. He collected a large library of music and books on music of the 1700s and earlier, even had original manuscripts by Mozart, and had a correspondence going with several music historians. As a result, some considered him a conservative and traditionalist, at a time when tradition was being questioned or overturned. And so public performances of his works in Germany often caused debate. Later, ironically, he was considered too advanced in many countries, including America. When the Boston Symphony Orchestra considered adding one of his compositions, someone changed the sign above the exit door to read, "Exit in case of Brahms." Brahms eventually tired of the controversy and of Hamburg. He finally moved to Vienna after he was turned down for a post as conductor of the music school in Hamburg, a position he'd badly wanted. He got the same post in Vienna, but he later gave it up to devote his entire time to composing. One of his masterpieces of this time was the German Requiem, which premiered at the Bremen Cathedral in 1868 when Brahms was 35. The Requiem was a great success, made even better by the fact that Brahms' father had traveled from Hamburg to attend the opening. Before the program began, Brahms commented to a friend that the evening would be perfect except for the absence of his good friend Clara Schumann. He was ecstatic when Clara suddenly appeared just in time to enter the cathedral with him arm in arm. Brahms lived in Vienna for 26 years, in the same apartment with a routine and habits that seldom changed. He rose at 4 or 5 a.m., dressed in comfortable clothes that usually included a flannel shirt, and that were probably picked up from the floor where he dropped them the night before. He made his coffee, then went for a walk in the woods where he could listen to the birds singing. Just like Beethoven, he walked with his hands clasped behind his back. When he returned, he would begin his work. Brahms wrote his music slowly and meticulously. He put as much thought into his music as inspiration, and once claimed, "It does not just come to you, it is torture." He was self-critical and a perfectionist. If he wasn't absolutely satisfied with a work, he would burn it or throw it in a river. Every day Brahms ate at the Red Hedgehog restaurant. As he grew older, people used to tease him that he'd begun to look like a hedgehog. Brahms had a long, white, bushy beard, topped by a white mustache, which curled at the ends. He joked that before his beard, he looked like Clara Schumann's son, and after it, he looked like her father. Brahms had uncommonly short legs, and his belly was big and round. If there was anything Brahms loved as much as music, it was food. He claims to have received the idea for his Third Symphony after finishing off a meal of asparagus and champagne. Other favorite dishes included herring and, for breakfast, sardines. He'd finish the sardines and then drink the oil right from the can. Brahms also loved eggnog, and he drank 3 glasses of beer with every dinner. When he became ill and his doctor put him on a strict diet, Brahms complained that he was planning on having dinner that night with a friend, and it was to be chicken paprika. "Out of the question," said the doctor. Brahms responded, "Very well then, please consider that I did not come to consult you until tomorrow." For several years after the Requiem, Brahms served as the musical director for an organization called the Society of the Friends of Music. Then, while on a holiday near Heidelberg, he finally began his first symphony. Brahms was 42 when he started his famous symphonies, completing the first and sketching the second all within the same year. Although it was his first writing of a symphony, the music had been developing in his mind for 10 years, and so it emerged polished and mature. During the following 10 years, he composed the second, third, and fourth symphony, each very different, each destined to take a place in the world's greatest music. Brahms received an honorary degree from the University of Breslau, and to thank them he wrote one of his most popular compositions, the Academic Festival Overture. By now, awards and decorations were being offered from all over Europe, and Brahms jokingly remarked, "Decorations mean nothing to me. I only want to have them." He enjoyed recognition, but the attention could also annoy him. As his fame increased, he began to appreciate his beard, saying, "It allows me to trot about so nice and anonymous." Although he could be disagreeable, Brahms always had a certain modesty about his work and a discomfort with overblown praise. After he'd achieved success in Berlin, a special dinner was given for him, at which the host proposed a toast to the most famous composer. Very quickly, Brahms interrupted with, "Quite right, here's to Mozart," and then hastily clinked glasses all around. At another dinner, a great wine connoisseur brought out one of his best bottles and announced, "This is the Brahms of my cellar." Brahms took a tentative sip and then commented, "Better bring out your Beethoven." Brahms traveled widely during his years of success, on concert tours or as a solo pianist. But although he performed in most of the countries of Europe, he always refused to go to England. He liked to stay on the continent. By middle age, he was well known throughout that continent and admired by most of the leading musicians and composers of his time. With Wagner's death in 1883, Brahms became Germany's most famous composer. Brahms and Johannes Strauss had a particular admiration for each other's work, and finally met in Vienna. Strauss asked Brahms to sign his autograph book, and Brahms happily agreed. Opening to a blank page, he jotted down the opening bars of The Blue Danube, and then wrote beneath it, "Unfortunately, not by Johannes Brahms." After that, they became good friends and often dined together. As an old man, Brahms appeared in public only to conduct his own work. People took delight in watching him conduct, even though he sometimes forgot to fasten his suspenders and had to grab his pants before they fell down. Brahms was known for his checked cotton underwear. Even when he wasn't conducting, his short baggy pants often revealed the underwear beneath. Brahms made his will out when he was 58 and announced to his friends that he was going to stop composing and enjoy the time left to him. Several months went by, and as he'd vowed, Brahms wrote not a single note. But there came a day when suddenly a new composition by Brahms had its public debut. "I thought you weren't going to write anymore," said a friend. Brahms replied, "I wasn't, but after a few days away from it, I was so happy at the thought of no more writing that the music came out of me without effort." This music without effort that poured forth in his last years was among some of his best work. He returned to writing for piano, as he'd done in his early days. And in his very last two works, he turned to religious themes. Much of Brahms' music was written with his friend Clara Schumann in mind. They wrote hundreds of letters to each other over the years, some of which they later destroyed. She advised him on musical matters and career decisions, and helped him invest his money. As Brahms became more and more popular, he also became one of the few composers who didn't have to take outside work to support himself. He never cared a great deal about money and gave much of it to his family and friends. The death of Clara Schumann in the year 1896 was in some ways Brahms' own death. As soon as he heard she'd died, he hurried to Frankfurt to attend her funeral. There was some difficulty in catching his train, and Brahms, overcome with grief and anxiety, went into a terrific rage. Shortly after, he became ill and was sent to Carlsbad to recover. He never did recover, and he always insisted it was his burst of anger that had destroyed his health. In fact, doctors had discovered cancer of the liver. He died in Vienna, April 3, 1897, less than a year after Clara had died. The line of mourners behind his funeral procession stretched farther than the eyes could see, and the flags off the docks of Hamburg, where he used to play piano as a young boy, were lowered to half-mast. Brahms is credited more than any composer of the late 1800s for reviving what's called absolute music. That is, music that stands on its own, as Beethoven's did, without depicting a scene or telling a story, as program music does. The techniques Brahms used were established and traditional, but he used them in such fresh ways that listeners noticed the beauty of the music first and his technical mastery last. His music is organized around classical elements, yet it reflects many traits of the Romantic movement that was just then taking flight. The result was a very personal and unique musical style, filled with fresh melodies and harmonies that were often very lyrical. After his first piano compositions, Brahms went on to more complex works, such as his German Requiem, based on Martin Luther's Bible. It was the Requiem, written when he was 35, that moved Brahms into the front rank of German composers. Today, it's still considered one of the most significant works of 19th century choral music. Brahms' choral music is considered the finest Protestant church music since Johannes Bach, one of the other great B's. Besides his popular choral music, Brahms is known for his Lieder, which means songs, and for his chamber music, organ music, and piano concertos. The only musical form of his day he didn't try was the opera. In fact, he once joked, "I cannot make up my mind to either a first opera or a first marriage." Brahms had a love of folk songs which sometimes gave his music a light and dazzling quality, as in this popular piece, Hungarian Dances No. 5 in G minor. This playful folk music and some other pieces aside, most of Brahms' music was serious. It's his 4 symphonies, considered among the greatest in music, for which Brahms is most remembered. Brahms' symphonies, which he didn't write until he was in his 40s, are standard works for every symphony orchestra, just like those of Beethoven. The First Symphony, formerly entitled First Symphony in C minor, was dubbed Beethoven's 10th, a nickname that caught on with both his admirers and his detractors. To the detractors, it implied he was repeating what had already been done. To his admirers, it implied that he had carried on the brilliant legacy of Beethoven. The famous horn solo in Brahms' First Symphony was originally jotted down on a postcard which he sent to Clara Schumann from his summer home in the Tyrol. Brahms followed his First Symphony with the Second Symphony in D major. Then, during the 1880s, Brahms wrote his Third Symphony in F major and his Fourth Symphony in E minor. His last symphony is believed to have been inspired by the ancient tragedies of Sophocles, which he was reading at the time. Although the struggles of Johannes Brahms in trying to bring his great music to life were not the struggles of Greek heroes, just the same they required perseverance and faith. His was an unusual story because where other great artists were criticized for daring to introduce what was new and unfamiliar, he was criticized for not doing so. An artist takes risks by going forward, backward, up, out, or any direction, as long as it's not the direction that's popular at the moment. But by the strength of his own conviction, through the support of strong friendship, and with his own genius, Brahms proved once again that convention seldom has the last word. Not only did his greatness come to be recognized in his own age, but it has endured ever since. Almost 200 years after he died, a survey was taken of California musicians, asking them to name their single favorite composer. The composer who ranked number one? Johannes Brahms. Oh, yes, and what of that famous Brahms lullaby? It was the only one he ever wrote.